This is the Ink Therapist. Real talk about healing, bodies, and the world we're actually living in. Welcome to the Ink Therapist. Before we get started, a quick reminder. I'm a licensed therapist, but listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship between us. The information shared here is for educational and entertainment purposes only and shouldn't replace professional mental health care. If you're in crisis or need personalized support, please reach out to a licensed mental health provider in your area or contact a crisis or warm line. And with that, let's jump in. I want to talk about a phrase that is doing a lot of unpaid emotional labor in a lot of people's lives. It could be worse. You stub your toe. It could be worse. Your relationship is quietly falling apart. It could be worse. You've been not okay for months and you're not sure anyone has noticed. It could be worse. At least you have your health. At least you have a roof. At least you're not. And there it is. The comparison that's supposed to make you feel better. It doesn't, does it? Here's the thing I find the most interesting about "it could be worse" as a phrase. It's technically almost always true. It could, in fact, nearly always be worse. There is almost no situation so bad that a more catastrophic version isn't theoretically possible, which means "it could be worse" is both factually accurate and completely useless as comfort. A fact that does nothing for the person hearing it. Actually, let me correct that. It doesn't do nothing. It does something quite specific. And that something is what this episode is about. Welcome to the Ink Therapist. I'm Del Knight, they, them, licensed psychotherapist, somatic therapist, certified body trust specialist, and this is episode 5. We just finished a 4-episode nervous system arc. If you haven't listened to those, they're worth going back to. We covered chronic vigilance, nervous system adaptation, slow therapy, and trans-affirming care. This episode stands alone, but everything we talked about in the arc is quietly present in it. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're talking one phrase, 4 words, and spending an hour understanding what those 4 words are actually doing in the body. Let's go. What "it could be worse" actually is. Let me give this pattern a name because I think naming it clearly is the first step to understanding what it does. What we're talking about is pain minimization. Pain minimization is the practice of responding to your own distress by immediately contextualizing it against something worse. The implicit logic is if someone else's pain is greater, your pain is less. And if your pain is less, you're less entitled to feel it, acknowledge it, express it, or seek support for it. The phrase "it could be worse" is one version, but it has a lot of close relatives. I shouldn't complain. Other people have it so much harder. I don't have the right to be upset about this. There are people who would kill to have my problems. I'm being too dramatic. Different words, same mechanism. The mechanism is locate your pain on a scale of comparative suffering, find someone lower on the scale, use their position to invalidate yours. Now, I want to ask you something. When was the last time you said one of those things to yourself? Not to someone else, to yourself. In your own internal monologue, in the quiet moments when something was hurting and you reached for a way to make it smaller. For most people, the answer is recently. Maybe today, maybe in the last hour. Because this pattern is extraordinarily common. And it's common for reasons we're going to get into. reasons that have less to do with individual psychology and more to do with what we've been taught about who gets to have pain and how much of it. But first, I want to stay with the pattern itself for a moment, because I think it's worth understanding how sophisticated it actually is. Pain minimization operates on several levels simultaneously. On the surface level, it looks like perspective, like maturity, like the admirable ability to keep things in context, to not catastrophize, to remember that your problems are small in the grand scheme of things. And sometimes it is those things. Sometimes stepping back and recognizing that a situation is manageable, that it will pass, that you've gotten through harder things, that's genuinely regulating. That's the nervous system finding footing. But there's a version of it could be worse that isn't finding footing. That's cutting your legs out from under you before you've even tried to stand. The difference is in what happens after the phrase. If it could be worse helps you regulate and move, okay, that's perspective doing its job. However, if it could be worse makes you feel like you have no right to feel what you're feeling, no ground to stand on, no legitimate claim to support or acknowledgement, that's not perspective. That's self-abandonment. And your nervous system knows the difference. I want to also name that pain minimization is frequently applied externally before it's internalized, meaning most of us learn this pattern from somewhere, from a family system where complaining wasn't tolerated, from a culture that valorized stoicism and pathologized emotional expression, from communities where real suffering was so visible and so severe that individual pain felt selfish to acknowledge, from systems, medical, educational, legal, that consistently communicated that your experience was less valid, less urgent, less worth attending to than it actually was. We are taught to minimize our pain, and then we become very good at doing it to ourselves without any external prompt automatically before the pain has even fully registered. That automation is what I want to talk about next. What it does to your nervous system. Okay, let's talk about what actually happens in your body when you say it could be worse to yourself. Because I think most people understand intellectually that dismissing their pain isn't ideal. What they don't understand, and what changes the picture considerably, is what's happening below the intellectual level, in the nervous system, in the body. Here's what I want you to hold onto from the nervous system arc. Your nervous system is a signal generating system. It is constantly producing responses to what's happening in your environment and your internal experience. Those responses are information. They are your body's best attempt to tell you something about the situation. Pain is a signal. Distress is a signal. Grief, anger, fear, the particular hollow feeling of not being okay, these are all signals. They mean something. They are trying to get your attention for a reason. And when you respond to those signals with, it could be worse, what you are doing functionally is telling your nervous system that its signal was not legitimate, that it was not worth responding to, and that it should stop. Here's what your nervous system does with that information. It doesn't stop. The nervous system doesn't work like an alert you can dismiss. It doesn't have a message received, standing down function that activates when you tell it its signal wasn't valid. What it has is a system that registers whether the signal was acknowledged. And when it isn't, It does what systems do when their output is ignored. It stores it. The pain doesn't go away because you told it other people have it worse. It goes underground. What does that look like in the body? It looks like tension you've stopped noticing because it's just always there in your shoulders, your jaw, the base of your skull, your gut. It looks like baseline level fatigue that sleep doesn't fully resolve because your system is working overnight, not resting, still processing what you told it not to process during the day. It looks like emotional responses that seem disproportionate to their triggers, a moment of ordinary frustration that cracks open into something much bigger because the ordinary frustration just broke the surface of everything that's been accumulating underneath it. It looks like difficulty being present, a sense of moving through your life slightly adjacent to it, because some part of your attention is perpetually occupied with managing what you've decided isn't allowed to be felt. It looks like a body that is working very hard and getting very little rest, and getting more exhausted by the year. I want to name something that I think is one of the most underappreciated costs of chronic pain minimization. When you routinely dismiss your own pain, when you have trained yourself to immediately reach for a more extreme comparison every time something hurts, you eventually start to lose access to your own experience. Not just the pain, the experience. You stop being able to accurately assess what's okay and what isn't, what's sustainable and what's burning you out, what you actually need and what you've simply learned to do without. Your nervous system has been trying to tell you these things, and you have been consistently telling it that what it's saying doesn't count. And eventually, not immediately, but over time, through years of that practice, it gets quieter. Not because things are better, but because it's learned that signaling doesn't lead anywhere. That's a significant loss, and it is reversible, but it requires stopping the war on your own experience. Where it comes from, the nuanced truth. I want to slow down here because I think this is where the honest conversation gets more complicated. I've been describing pain minimization as something that costs you, and it does. Everything I said in the last section is true, but I also want to name something that is equally true. For a lot of people, it could be worse wasn't originally a choice. It was a survival strategy. And survival strategies deserve respect, even when we're examining their cost. Think about where pain minimization gets learned. It gets learned in families where emotional expression was dangerous, where a child who cried was told they were being dramatic, where a child who showed hurt was punished for it, where the only safe emotional posture was no emotional posture at all. In those families, learning to minimize pain quickly was protective. It kept you out of harm's way. It regulated the environment. It reduced the distance between you and whatever safety was available. It gets learned in communities, and I want to be specific here, where survival has required a particular kind of resilience, where showing weakness could literally cost you, where the stoicism was not a character flaw, but a necessary adaptation to conditions that didn't leave room for anything else. Black communities in America have been told both explicitly and repeatedly that their pain is less valid, less credible, less worth attending to. That their suffering doesn't register the same way on the scale that the dominant culture uses to measure suffering. Learning to minimize pain in that context is not weakness. It is wisdom about what the world will and won't acknowledge. It gets learned in systems, healthcare, education, social services, that have consistently communicated to certain bodies and certain people that their reports of pain are unreliable, that their distress is exaggerated, that they need to present a more extreme version of suffering to just be taken seriously. When you have to perform your pain at a certain level to be believed, when you have learned that understating is safer than overstating, because at least understatement doesn't risk being dismissed as dramatic, you learn to minimize, to calibrate, to find the register that gets you heard without getting you hurt or pathologized. That's not dysfunction. That's navigating a world that has its thumb on the scale. I want to hold all of that with real respect. I'm not here to tell you that the pain minimization you developed was wrong. I am not here to pathologize the way you survived. What I am here to ask, and this is the question that I think opens something, is, does it still need to work this hard? Are you still in the room where pain expression was dangerous? Are the stakes still what they were when you learned this? For some people, the honest answer is yes. The conditions are ongoing. The threat is current. The minimization is still protective. And for some people, maybe for you, if you've made it this far in this episode, the conditions have changed more than the adaptation has. You're not in that room anymore. But the nervous system is still operating as though you are. And that's not a flaw. That's just a nervous system that hasn't had enough evidence yet that things are different. Providing that evidence slowly in a context that can hold it is exactly the kind of work that somatic therapy does. Hey, quick pause before we keep going. If you've been listening for a while, you know the show is rooted in the belief that healing shouldn't be a luxury, and I try to practice that, not just say it. At Soma Roots Therapy, I hold sliding scale and pro bono spots for folks who need care and can't afford full fee. Queer, trans, and neurodivergent people especially, who are already navigating systems that weren't built with them in mind. Those spots are real, and keeping them open has a real cost. So I've set up a support page on BuyMeACoffee where you can directly contribute to that access fund. If monthly giving works for you, there's a 4 membership tier starting at $5 a month, from Seed Keeper to Liberation Patron. It all goes towards the same thing. And if monthly isn't your thing, you can also make a one-time contribution at whatever amount feels right. No minimum, no pressure. If that resonates, the link is in the show notes. And if you're in a season where giving isn't possible, that's okay. Just keep listening. That matters too. All right, back to it. The comparative suffering problem. I want to spend some time on the internal logic of it could be worse, because I think if we follow it all the way through, it leads somewhere that reveals how genuinely unworkable it is as a system. The implicit premise is your pain is only valid if it is the worst pain, or at least worse than some agreed upon threshold. Okay, let's follow that. If that premise holds, then only one person in the world at any given moment has valid pain. The person whose suffering is objectively the most extreme. Everyone else, the entire rest of humanity, has pain that is less than the worst pain, and therefore, by this logic, pain they are not entitled to fully feel. That's the end of the road of it could be worse as a system. It produces a world in which virtually no one's pain is valid, including yours, including the person you're comparing yourself to, because there's almost certainly someone worse off than them. The scale has no bottom that would finally make the suffering on it legitimate. Pain doesn't work on a comparative scale. This is not a therapeutic opinion. This is how pain actually functions in the nervous system. Your nervous system does not have access to a database of all human suffering that it cross-references before deciding whether to produce a pain response. It responds to what is happening in your body, in your life, in your relationships, in your environment right now. When you are in pain, your nervous system is not asking whether someone else is in more pain. It is generating a response to your actual experience. That response is proportional to your actual experience. It is not disproportionate simply because someone else's experience is worse. The comparison doesn't change the physiology. What it changes is your relationship to the physiology. It adds the layer of, I shouldn't be feeling this, on top of the feeling itself. And now you're managing two things: the original pain and the shame about the original pain. That's a heavier load, not a lighter one. I also want to name something about what the comparative suffering model asks of specific people. It asks the most of the people who have the most legitimate reasons to be in pain. People navigating systemic oppression, racism, transphobia, ableism, poverty are often the people who get "it could be worse" applied most aggressively, from outside and from within, because the conditions of their lives have produced a particular familiarity with suffering. They are sometimes implicitly expected to have a higher tolerance for it, to need less acknowledgement, to be more resilient. That is a profound injustice dressed up as a compliment. Resilience is not the same as not needing care. And the people who have survived the most are not people who need less. They are people who deserve more acknowledgement, more support, more space to let the pain be what it actually is without performing equanimity for an audience. And finally, the comparative suffering model asks you to do something that is emotionally impossible. It asks you to feel your pain and not feel your pain at the same time. To acknowledge that something hurts because your body is already telling you it does, and you can't simply override that, and simultaneously to conclude that it shouldn't hurt that much, that you should feel less than you feel, that the legitimate response to your actual experience is something smaller than what your body is producing. That is not perspective. That is a request for a kind of control over your internal experience that human beings do not have. Your feelings are not a volume knob. You cannot simply turn them down because you've decided they're too loud. What you can do is change your relationship to them. And that starts with letting them be what they actually are. What it means to let pain be what it is. I want to talk about what it actually means to let pain be what it is. Not as a therapeutic instruction, not as a technique, as an experience. because I think there's a version of allow your feelings that gets offered in therapy and wellness contexts that sounds right and lands hollow. Like something you're supposed to do that no one has ever actually explained. So let me try to explain what I mean when I say it. Letting pain be what it is doesn't mean dwelling in it. It doesn't mean refusing to move past it. It doesn't mean building a home in the worst version of what you're feeling and staying there. It means, first, acknowledging that it's there. Not performing the acknowledgement, not saying, yes, I know I'm upset, while the rest of you is already reaching for the comparison that will make the upset smaller. But actually pausing, noticing, letting your attention rest on what's actually happening in your body in this moment. There is something there. It has a location. It has a texture. It might have a temperature or a weight or a quality of movement or stillness. Just notice it without immediately doing anything about it. One of the things I like to say to clients when we're doing this is, you don't need words for it right now. In fact, let's not try and put words to this right now. Just notice it in your body. The second thing it means is resisting the reflex to immediately contextualize. The reflex is fast. You're probably very good at it. The moment something hurts, the comparison is ready. Other people, worse situations, the ways it could be harder. Try, and I say try because this is genuinely difficult if the pattern is old. Try to let the pain exist for a moment before the contextualization arrives. Not forever, just for a breath. Just long enough to notice that it's there and that it's real before you start measuring it against something else. That small window, that breath before the comparison, is where something different can happen. It's where your nervous system can register, I was heard. Not fixed, not resolved, not made smaller, just heard. That matters more than it sounds like it should. Because a nervous system that has been routinely told its signals don't count will do something very different when for once a signal is acknowledged rather than dismissed. It settles, just slightly, just enough to know that it doesn't have to keep escalating to be taken seriously. The third thing it means is extending to yourself the same basic acknowledgement you would extend to someone you love. If someone you cared about came to you in pain and said, I know it could be worse. I know other people have it harder. I know I'm being dramatic. What would you say to them? I'm going to guess you wouldn't agree. I'm going to guess you wouldn't say, you're right. Actually, pull yourself together. I'm going to guess you would say something like, I hear you. That sounds really hard. You don't have to minimize this for me. That's what I'm asking you to say to yourself. Not in a scripted affirmation poster way, in the real, messy, human way that acknowledges something difficult without immediately trying to make it manageable. You are allowed to be in pain without ranking it first. Your nervous system is allowed to signal without being dismissed. The pain is allowed to be what it actually is. I want to name one more thing before we move to the close. Letting pain be what it is not the same as being in pain forever. One of the fears underneath pain minimization, and I think it's worth naming it because I think a lot of people feel, even if they don't articulate it, is that if I let myself really feel this, I will be overwhelmed. I will not be able to function. I will go under and not come back. One of the ways that many of my clients, past and present, have said this very thing is, if I open this, I'll never be able to close it again. Look, that fear makes sense, especially for people who've had the experience of being in pain that wasn't held, pain that was too much, too early, in a context that couldn't contain it. But here is what I've seen in clinical work over and over. Pain that is acknowledged moves. It doesn't stay at the same intensity forever. It doesn't consume you. It processes. It's the pain that isn't acknowledged that sticks, that accumulates, that shows up in the jaw and the shoulders and the inexplicable tears at the wrong moment. Feeling it is not the danger. Not feeling it is what costs you. So here's what I want you to carry from this episode. The next time you catch yourself reaching for, it could be worse, and you will, because the pattern is fast and familiar, see if you can pause for just one breath before the comparison arrives. Not to stop the comparison forever, not to suddenly feel everything you've been not feeling, just one breath in which you notice something hurts. That's real. It's here. That's it. That's the whole invitation. One breath before the dismissal. See what that changes. So if you found this episode something in you, if there's a version of this pattern you've been living with for a long time and you're tired of how much it costs, I want you to know that this is exactly the kind of thing we work on at Soma Roots Therapy. The relationship between you and your own experience. The long-held habit of telling your nervous system that it's too much, that it shouldn't, that other people have it worse. We go slowly, we follow your lead, and we don't require you to have a reason that's, quote, bad enough to justify care. You don't need to rank your pain before you're allowed to heal it. Soma Roots Therapy is actively accepting new clients in Oregon and Washington. Shout out to my Tacoma area folks. Sessions are done via telehealth. I'm in network with a variety of commercial insurances, and sliding scale and self-pay options are also available. Next episode, we're going to talk about something I get asked about a lot, both by clients and by the people who are thinking about becoming clients. What actually happens in a first therapy session? What should you expect? What are you allowed to ask? And what does it mean if you leave feeling like it wasn't the right fit? That one's going to be practical and I think useful for a lot of people who are on the fence about reaching out. I hope you'll be there. And thank you for being here, for spending an hour with 4 words and what they do to your body. Your pain is real. It's allowed to be real. You don't need a comparison to make it legitimate. I'm Del Knight. This is the Ink Therapist. Slow down, feel it, root deeper. See you next time.